Hello, this is Pastor Quincy Wheeler from Cuyahoga Falls Church of the Nazarene here to talk to you about episode 3 of The Chosen Season 5. Chosen is a free TV series about the life of Jesus. Right now, as I film this video, it's only available on Amazon Prime, but in September, it'll be available on the free app, and I hope you get a chance to watch this season all about the Last Supper and the events of Holy Week leading up to the Last Supper. So, as every episode does, we begin with scenes of Jesus speaking to his disciples at the Last Supper. And the scriptures that I wrote down here that he spoke about were from John 13:36, from John 14:1 through 14, verses 17 through 21, and verses 25 through 31. So a lot of John 14 in this passage. Philip and Thaddeus both ask questions in John 14, which comes up here. Jesus goes back to John 13:38 to ask Peter, will you lay down your life for me? To really make Peter think about what's about to come and that Jesus is aware of what's about to come. But the verses from John 14 are obviously verses that echo through all eternity for Christians. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God, trust also in me. I'm going there to prepare a place for you. If it were not so, I would have told you. My Father's house, there are many rooms. Scriptures that I hold very dear to my heart, so it was amazing to see these scriptures portrayed in front of us as we prepare for a very difficult period in Jesus' life, of course, the most difficult in his life, and for his disciples, and for all of us who will be watching. So then we go back to Jesus clearing the temple. Atticus tells soldiers to stand down to let Jesus make a statement. Atticus is trying to deal with the situation with Jesus by letting him implicate himself if he wants to. He calls this a den of thieves. Jesus does. Matthew 21:13 gives us that phrase. Psalm 69 verse 9 tells us that zeal for God's house eats Jesus up, and John 2:17 quotes this. Jesus is zealous for God's house. What's happening here doesn't reflect what God wants for worship. A lot of John chapter 2 verses 18 through 20 is included in the scene. Jesus saying, tear down this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. The Pharisees misunderstanding, of course, but Jesus speaking about his own body, that he will be killed and he'll bring his body back to life. I do question when the Pharisees say, by whose authority are you doing these things? And Jesus says, my own authority. Jesus a lot of times doesn't answer that question, but also he always points to that his authority has been given to him by the Father. So I wasn't quite sure why the show felt that he should say, I do this by my own authority. Now, Jesus does say the Father gives him authority, and he has authority to lay down his life and to pick it up again in John, so maybe they're trying to reference that, but I thought that was an awkward turn of phrase that wasn't necessarily needed. The Pharisees continue to debate about Jesus, asking each other, well, how can we implicate him? How can we stop him? They decide to ask him questions because Jesus is notably honest, and he'll probably say something that will make things clear so that the people can reject him and that they can get him out of their lives. We see Kaphne, Rama's dad, Thomas's hope to be father-in-law at one point, figuring out how much money Jesus cost the vendors in the temple and trying to get people to turn against him. He's working behind the scenes. This little subplot is something that season 5 focuses on a little bit more than what I think they have to, but I think they're trying to sow the seeds as to how the people who are excited about Jesus as Messiah might eventually turn their backs on him, because Jesus does things that we don't expect and asks sacrifices from us that we're not willing to make. Judas isn't willing to make the sacrifices Jesus is asking of him. He questions Jesus after the clearing of the temple, why he's doing this, what the effects will be, and Jesus says he needs to have time alone to pray. He references Matthew 6:33 to seek first the kingdom and everything else will be added. All your questions will be answered if you seek first the kingdom, put God's kingdom first. Then the disciples go to discuss Jesus clearing the temple. They very importantly point out that he did not strike anyone. He did not commit an act of violence against anyone, but he certainly was violent, and his violence had effects on others who were part of the event. And Judas says this event was seen as an assault on our nations. He's making more enemies at a time he's supposed to be making friends, and Judas doesn't understand, and we continue to understand the arc that Judas is taking of eventually becoming part of the enemies of Jesus. Atticus and Caiaphas come to Pilate after this event. Atticus is concerned. Caiaphas says they have a plan. He's popular. There's a conversation. Pilate just wants to get back to his massage, but Atticus reminds him that Rome isn't going to be patient if he fails this, if he flubs this, and Pilate has to keep that in mind and maybe execute a little firmer hand at some point here, trying to set up the decision that Pilate eventually will make regarding Jesus and his execution. Still, the disciples are discussing what's going on with Jesus, and it makes us as an audience ask the question, would we support what Jesus does if we were his followers, if it was something completely different than what we expected? If Jesus overturned the tables of the people we thought were on our side, would we be okay with it? Finally, Matthew has a nice scene with Jesus where he talks with him, and Jesus says, above all, you seek understanding. And Matthew says, no, above all, I seek you. And that's a beautiful scene where Matthew is showing in his heart he really understands what's important. And Jesus affirms that and says, you understand enough, and you'll understand more if you listen and observe. Listen to my word. A reminder from Jesus to just take time to listen. I've been preaching in Jeremiah 6, and God talks about how the people of Israel just simply don't listen to him. And I think it's really important that we all think of that when we think about what we need to do to follow Jesus. Just listening for his voice and trying to respond is so important. Then we see Jesus telling parables in the temple courts again. He tells the parable of the vineyard from Matthew 20, verses 1 through 16. And then he's questioned by the Pharisees. He's questioned from Matthew 21, verses 23 through 27, about what authority he's using again, and he points them to the fact they won't answer as to where John the Baptist got the authority to perform miracles, and Jesus pointing out that their main concern isn't really getting to the bottom of the issue, but gaining and consolidating political power over the people. Jesus tells the parable of the tenants from Matthew 21, verses 33 through 46. And both of these parables of the vineyard and the tenants seem to relate very strongly to the Pharisees and how they aren't being responsible with what God has given them and instead turning to violence against God's very own Messiah, his son, and Jesus is pointing that out in these parables. Then he's questioned about paying taxes to Caesar in Matthew 22, verses 15 through 21. Jesus' response here is brilliant about give to Caesar what is Caesar and to God's what is God's. But I actually felt like The Chosen here adds a little bit more explanation than what's needed. It's very simple. Jesus says, look, this coin belongs to Caesar. Human beings bearing God's image belong to him. Don't really know that we needed to go into, well, Rome does a good job with roads and provides government benefits. Jesus never says that in Scripture, and it felt a little bit like the scriptwriters trying to inject a little bit of their own theology about how we're supposed to behave as citizens of a government, maybe looking to what Paul says in Romans instead of what Jesus says and doesn't say. And I didn't love that. I think the scriptwriters do a great job not trying to inject theology, but this was interesting to see them make that decision. I don't think I find Jesus to be someone who was supportive of Rome, certainly tolerant of Rome and respectful of Rome, but I do think it might have caused more of an issue for him if he'd have been as publicly supportive of Rome as he is presented to be in the scene. We again see Jesus confronted about what's the greatest commandment in Matthew 22, verses 34 through 40. He responds in a brilliant fashion, of course, saying, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and connecting that Shema phrase to love your neighbor as yourself, something that Jesus is somewhat unique in doing in all of theological history for the Jewish people. These are the two commandments that are the same. If you love God, you're going to love others. You're going to know how to love others because you love God, and you learn how to love God by loving others. So crucial to the teachings of Jesus. Jesus then turns to woes that he speaks against the Pharisees. You can find these woes in Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 33. Jesus is very clear that the Pharisees are opposing God's work, and that if you want to be part of God's work, you need to oppose the Pharisees. Finally, he ends this passage, this scene, with Matthew 23, verses 37 through 39, at least this interaction with the Pharisees, I should say, saying, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I long to gather you together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you are not willing. And Jesus begins to speak about the destruction of the temple to the disciples as they leave. He says, not one stone here will be left on another. Don't get used to the temple. This is the last time I'm going to preach in the temple. This is not where you're going to go and meet with God. The disciples have follow-up questions about that, and we see Jesus answering those questions while looking at Jerusalem. I thought this was beautifully presented in the scene. It gives us these verses from Matthew 24, verses 4 through 14, verse 36, saying no one knows that exact time and day when Jerusalem and the temple are going to be destroyed. And verse 42, be on guard, be awake, keep in mind what's going to happen. Jesus crying over the city of Jerusalem, that's found in Luke chapter 19, verse 42, saying, if you'd only known what would make for peace, the things that would make for peace, but they're hidden from your eyes. And I love the heartbreak in Jesus that Jerusalem doesn't see it, that the people of God do not see the arrival of his Messiah, his son. And because of that, in just a few years down the road, Jerusalem and the temple will be destroyed, and the people will have no place to worship God. And that temple has never been rebuilt. And part of what Jesus is communicating in this moment is that I'm the temple. My body's the temple. Your relationship with me, that's the temple where we go and meet with God. That's where your focus should be. And his heart breaks that God's people reject God's Messiah. Finally, there's this beautiful scene, this little moment at the end of the episode where Jesus hears someone singing and he has a vision of David. David here is singing Psalm chapter 5, and Jesus is just struck by this, and then David disappears. Jesus is clearly troubled in mind and spirit as he approaches his final day on this earth as one of us, and I love that the show presents that to us and all the scriptures that they use to make that clear. So while this episode had a couple of leaps that I wasn't a huge fan of, overall, the parables are well contextualized. The scenes of clearing the temple and confronting the Pharisees are great. The disciples trying to puzzle out what Jesus means and what he's all about, really neat. And finally, that scene of David popping up at the end is really special. I also appreciated that even though Jenkins comes from a family that is very dispensationalist and all about kind of the rapture theology, he was very, at least him and his scriptwriters here were very clear that when Jesus is speaking about the destruction of Jerusalem, that's what he's talking about. We don't need to fast forward thousands of years in the future and pretend Jesus is talking about the rapture or whatever. Here he is talking about the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem and warning God's people that's going to happen. I think that's very important for Christians to recognize, and I appreciate that The Chosen made that clear.